Started. I'd love to welcome everybody to Grand Rounds this week, October 12th. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to introduce my colleague, Dr. Jennifer Spicer, who is an assistant professor of medicine. She is a Emory maid, although she might dispute that since she started at UGA. She is a graduate of the Emory School of Medicine, the J. Willis Hurst residency program. She was chief resident and then completed her infectious disease fellowship here at Emory, and fortunately for all of us, joined faculty at that time. She's also currently completing her master's in health professions education at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Jen holds, Dr. Spicer holds multiple UME and GME roles. These include being the course director of Prologue 2 for the medical students, and she is the subspecialty education coordinator and the director of the distinction in medical education for the residency program. She is going to speak to us today on the myth of meritocracy, how our selection processes perpetuate inequity and steps we can take to rectify it. I think this is, I confess that I've actually heard this talk and was very excited for her to present it at Grand Rounds. I think while we are entering residency recruitment season and we're right in the midst of fellowship recruitment season, and it certainly holds lessons for that, I think it holds much broader lessons than for just those two processes, including how we look at new faculty. And so I think there is a ton to learn here, and I'm excited to hear it again. So thank you, Jen, for joining us this morning, and I will let you take it from here.
All right. Thank you, Wendy, for that really kind introduction. So today, this talk is one that I have had the opportunity to give a number of times since I first gave it to my own division back in April. And I always look forward to the conversation that happens after it. So first, I want to start with gratitude, because before I gave this talk within our own division, I reached out to a number of my colleagues to get their input on some of the thoughts that I had had after reading some recent articles in the medical education literature on this topic. And their input was incredibly valuable in the development of this talk. And even more than that, to Wendy Armstrong and Kimberly Manning, they helped give feedback on my initial talk and have sponsored me in incredible ways. A Twitter post from Kimberly Manning results in things going viral. And I have since given this talk more than 10 times at other institutions as well, which I think has led to a lot of great conversation. So I look forward to sharing it today. So these are the learning objectives for today. By the end of this, I'm hoping that we can all recognize that diversity is just important as excellence, and that these concepts actually go together. They are not competing. I want us to be able to explain why our current selection processes are problematic when we look at issues of equity, and then to be able to describe both some individual and system level changes that can be made to our processes. So I want to give the disclaimer that this is not a comprehensive overview. This is a huge topic. There's no way that I could address it all here, but I really want this to start a discussion among people who are involved in selection processes. And I bet that all of us are involved in some way in some selection process. So I hope this serves as something to reflect on. And then lastly, I want to give the disclaimer that I recognize that I am giving this talk as a white woman from Central Georgia, and I grew up in a 2-physician household. So when I think about selection processes, I've actually had a lot of privilege based on my resources and opportunities. And I recognize that some of you may be wondering why I am talking about this. And I think that that is fair. I think all of us need to be talking about this, though. So I hope that we can engage in discussion at the end. So here's the outline for today. I first want to introduce some general topics and then to delve into selection processes and discuss some of the issues and solutions related to metrics that we use and how we interact with applicants. And then close with some really concrete examples of ways that places have changed their selection processes in a positive way. So first, the introduction. we know that racial inequity persists among medical students. So if we take a look at the general population and what we call the representation quotient, which is the proportion of medical students that represent the same demographic group in the general population, we can see that those underrepresented in medicine remain underrepresented over time. So the changes that we've tried to make haven't really done much, and we need to do better. But more than that, medical students also come from a very wealthy background. So more than 50% of medical students come from households where the parental income is in the top 5th quintile. So we lack economic diversity among those in our field. And so why does this lack of diversity persist? It's something that we've talked about for a long time, maybe more so recently, but it's still been in the conversation. And probably one of the biggest reasons is that many of us approach the concept of diversity as a social justice issue. So we think about it as trying to be fair. And I think that's a great way to approach it and something that I certainly believe in. But the issue is when we start having conversations looking at applicants for any process, we'll start using metrics and say, well, this applicant doesn't quite meet our metrics. And when we have a debate about that, we let excellence or this concept of excellence win out. But what I would argue is that we have substantial literature actually showing that diversity leads to excellence. And so we need diversity if we want to achieve excellence within our organizations. We know that diversity improves outcomes in many areas, and within medicine, the health professions, we know that it improves patient outcomes. So those individuals who have trained in a setting with diverse colleagues and diverse patient populations end up having better patient outcomes in the future. We know that racial, cultural, ethnic concordance makes a difference for patient outcomes as well. We know that teams that are diverse have more innovative ideas. And lastly, we actually know that diversity on research teams leads to not only a higher number of publications, but also a higher number of citations for each of those publications. So I think that regardless of what our view is or what outcomes we care about, diversity is important. And I don't want to spend much more time going over the evidence for this because I want to focus on our topic today. And in general, we just need to aim to maximize this diversity. And until now, I haven't really spoken about what I mean by diversity. Clearly, I'm talking about racial diversity, ethnic diversity, but also diversity in other venues. So thinking about gender identity, sexual orientation, economic diversity, whether people come from rural or urban backgrounds, nationalities, political and religious views. And so in all of these areas, the more diverse we are and the more that we can mirror the populations we serve, the better the outcomes we can expect. So if we want to achieve diversity, what do we need to do? There are frameworks in the literature showing 4 different points at which we can intervene. And today I'm going to focus specifically on selection. And when I use the term selection, as Wendy alluded to, I mean more than just selection to training programs or medical school. I also mean selection to faculty positions or selection to leadership positions, such as division directors, chairs, deans, course leaders, selection for awards, and even selection for grants. So I imagine that all of us here are involved at some point in one of these processes. And so reflect on that today as I'm talking about some of the issues that we're going to discuss. So in general, within the US, we believe that selection processes should promote meritocracy, meaning that people who have demonstrated that they have certain abilities or merit, that helps us predict who is going to be successful in the future. And so by looking at all of these measurements, we can select the best candidate who will help our organization. So I want you to ask yourself the following questions for any selection process you're involved in. How do you define what a successful applicant is? What criteria do you use when you're interviewing and selecting individuals? And finally, how well do you think those criteria predict success, whatever success means for you? I hope that you continue to reflect on this after some of the data that I present on this topic. So I'm going to cover two general sources of inequity in our selection processes, the metrics we use and interpersonal interactions that we have with applicants. So let's start with some of the metrics. So I'm going to focus on selection processes for training programs, since that is what I'm more familiar with in the literature. So take a look at these two applicants applying to internal medicine residency. And I'd like you to consider what you think their chances are for acceptance. I think that most of us looking at this can say that top applicant looks like they are a superstar. We can imagine that if we are looking at applications or if we are advising a student, that they will probably get numerous interview invitations and be selected at many programs near the top of the rank list. Now, the candidate on the bottom probably isn't going to be interviewed quite as widely. And so let's think a little bit more about these applicants. We're presuming that what we have here, these measurements, tell us about their abilities. But we need to reflect on some of the differing opportunities and resources that these applicants may have had. So economic capital, what financial resources have they had? Has one applicant had to work part-time to support themselves or even their family? Did financial cost of education prevent them from going to certain institutions? Or did they have money to pay for test prep courses or to get extra question banks to prep for step 1, which we know leads to higher scores? What about their social capital? Who are the people that they know? And does that differ based on the places that they've been? Do they know people who are well known in your field? Do you see letters of recommendation from people that you recognize? What about cultural capital, which is considered kind of knowing how the game is played? So maybe one applicant is a first-generation applicant. They may not be quite as familiar with the application process. They may not know what's important to get on their CV or resume. And so these things also may play a role. And finally, symbolic capital. And this is the status that we think about when we see different things. So for example, I bet that many of us look at certain university names and equate them to a higher status place. We also may see different names on letters of recommendation and put more weight in certain letters if we recognize the person on the letter. So again, all of these different types of capital interweave and may be reasons why these applicants appear to have different abilities, but actually don't have different abilities. So I would propose that this concept of meritocracy is a myth, and I'm not the only one who has said that. There are many books on this topic, but I think breaking down this definition tells us a little bit about why. So first, we are trying to look at abilities and merit of individuals. But who is deciding what metrics are important? And what biases may they have? And are the metrics we're using actually predictive of what we want? Have they been validated for outcomes we care about? I've spoken about people having equal opportunities to demonstrate their abilities, and we know that this is something that is problematic in our current system. And finally, there are always people involved in the selection process. So how do their backgrounds influence who they select or what criteria they think are more important in the selection process? So I think that we hold these metrics and this concept of meritocracy so high because of the concept of the American dream, where we believe that hard work results in people being able to achieve what they want. We have anecdotes of exception where we can mention people that we know have achieved despite all of those obstacles. But I think really the most problematic thing when we start examining this is it forces us to look in the mirror. And I think it's a little uncomfortable sometimes to say that privilege did help us get to where we are. Now, the important thing is that does not take away our hard work or our abilities, but it's important to recognize that there are other people who also could achieve the things we would achieve if they had the same opportunities. So I want to dive a little bit into these specific metrics and how helpful they actually are. So when there was a survey back in 2009 of internal medicine program directors, it asked them to rank the importance of various metrics that they used in the residency application process. And I think an important thing to recognize here is that most of these metrics fall in the ACGME core competency of medical knowledge. And this is unfortunately because that is what's easiest for us to measure and use as objective criteria. So our metrics are really skewed towards this competency. And the metrics we do use are probably a little less useful than we think. So here's a framework that we use to think about the utility of metrics. We think about both the validity and the feasibility of using metrics. And in particular, I want to focus on these last two components of the validity framework, thinking about extrapolation, or does it predict what we actually care about? And consequences, does it result in any adverse consequences when we use it? In particular, inequity. So let's look at a few metrics we use. So first, letters of recommendation, and in particular, the medical student performance evaluation or the dean's letter. So does it predict what we care about? So we can think about something like passing the boards, which is clearly important to be able to practice. And it doesn't, which probably isn't surprising. This isn't really what we use it for. But does it predict whether or not somebody has good patient care skills? Not really based on the data that we have. Does it result in inequity? Well, we know that there are many demographic factors associated with biased language in letters, including the dean's letter. And these include different races and ethnicities that have fewer standout terms like excellent or outstanding listed. And for women, we know that letters tend to speak about their compassion more than their ability. Not to say that compassion is bad, but just to say that we focus more on that in letters. And this goes for whether the letter writer is male or female. What about awards? And I'm going to use AOA specifically here since it's something that is frequently used in residency applications. So does it predict whether somebody is going to pass the boards? There's some mixed data here. And in fact, it's not surprising that maybe it predicts that, because a lot of times we're using academic criteria to decide who will be in AOA. But what we probably care about here is also whether it predicts some of those professional attributes that we care about. So again, there's mixed data here about whether or not it predicts whether somebody will deliver good patient care. But does it result in inequity? Well, there are definitely studies showing that it does, and there are certain demographic factors associated with lower acceptance. And, I think a lot of times when we're using something like AOA, we're trying to get at some of those intangibles, people's citizenship, leadership skills, service, things like that. And surprisingly, in the studies, it is actually not associated with community service hours or leadership hours. So finally, what about standardized exams? This is something that has been debated a lot recently, especially with the USMLE going past fail for step 1. So does it predict what we care about? So it does predict whether you will pass boards. Now, we're going to come to the issue of whether the scores are actually helpful or not in a second. But passing USMLE exams predicts that you will pass boards. What about patient care? Does it predict how good somebody will be as a physician? So there's mixed data here, some showing positive correlations, some showing negative correlations, and some showing no correlations. But are there adverse consequences of inequity? So there are many demographic factors associated with worse performance that I've listed here. And actually, US citizenship is one of them. And what I would like to mention here is, clearly some of this has to do with people's financial resources and available time, because we know that the more questions you do to prepare for a standardized exam, the better you will do on that exam. But test prep and those board questions to practice on are extremely expensive. And some people have more or less time than others, particularly if they have a family when they're studying for these exams. Now, I mentioned that it predicts whether people will pass the boards, but I think the important thing here is to consider whether the actual score matters. And here is an example of a score report. This is from the last couple of years. And I want to draw your attention to this term sentence down at the bottom that says, if you tested repeatedly, your score would fall within one standard error of the estimate of your score 2/3 of the time. And that standard error of the estimate is 8 points. So what does that mean? If you took this on back-to-back days, your score may range anywhere from 197 to 213. So in fact, you need a 16-point difference on this exam to be able to say that there is a statistically meaningful result between applicants. Now, clearly that doesn't even speak to whether it is a clinically meaningful difference when people score differently on the test. And I would say probably not. So beware when using the score to really distinguish between applicants. And if you're interested in this debate and want to learn more, this is a fantastic Grand Rounds on YouTube from Dr. Brian Carmody, who has spent a lot of time researching and writing about this topic. So the bottom line is, for many of the selection criteria that we use, they lack validity. Part of that problem is, what is the gold standard for defining if somebody is a good physician? What do we even use to represent that? But the other thing is, they lack discriminatory power. So we know that maybe grades are predictive, but how much does it really matter if somebody has a 3.9 versus a 3.5? Does that matter? And finally, we know that they perpetuate systemic inequity. And I think it's important for us to recognize that when we're using these criteria. So let's go and talk about some solutions. So one thing that's been proposed is, should we just have a lottery? We're spending a lot of time here talking about how some of these criteria have limited predictive ability, and maybe lotteries are a way out of this. It would reduce mental and financial burdens that both the applicants and those sorting through applicants put in this process. And it would avoid overemphasis on marginal differences. And because it will be random, it would help prevent disparities that we're talking about. Now, I know in the US, we're not going to be going to this anytime soon. I think this goes very much against our culture, but I do think that it's an intriguing concept for us to be thinking about. Now, one thing that we've been talking about a lot in the US recently is the concept of holistic review. And many of you I know are familiar with this, but it's basically the concept that we use a broad range of relevant criteria to look through applicants. So what we want to do is figure out what criteria actually match our program's mission. What does our program care about? What experiences, competencies, attributes, and metrics? And then to consider how using those measurements may impact diversity. So this is from the AAMC website. I have a handout that will be put in the chat, and I have a link at the end of this presentation that has the resources that I am presenting here. But here is a great worksheet that you can use within your program to think about what experiences match your program's mission. Do you care a lot about community service or distance traveled, healthcare experience, working with medically underserved populations? And then what attributes do you care about most for your program? Leadership, maybe interest in the desired specialty, intellectual curiosity. Maybe you have a large immigrant population and proficiency in languages that your patient population speaks is incredibly important. Then what competencies matter to you? We've talked about medical knowledge being a little bit easier for us to measure. We have more information on our applications, but if you care a lot about interpersonal skills and communication, how are you going to determine that in your applicants? And finally, what metrics that we talked about are important to you? Now, publications, probably not that important for a lot of programs, especially for residency programs. This is something I know we talk a lot about at the fellowship level, but there's also lots of problems thinking about who has access to time to do research and to mentors, and how does that differ across institutions? So again, remembering that what we have on the application does not necessarily match with individuals' abilities. So once you've decided which of these are important, you need to define what you mean by it. And developing clear, unambiguous definitions is what helps mitigate against implicit bias. Because if we just use our gestalt when we look at an application, that allows our bias to come into play more. So how are you going to actually assess those requirements? This is something that we need to really consider here. Again, make sure that we predict what we care about. And this is something that I'm going to have on the handouts. There are 3 systematic reviews or meta-analyses looking at all of the different things that we use to predict outcomes. And so that is something that we will share as well. So then think about what data do your interviewers or your committee actually need. So once you've decided if people meet your threshold for an exam score per se, if you're using step 1 as a screening criteria to make sure that you have applicants who've at least passed it, but you actually don't care about their scores, do you need to provide that? Think about things like images and pictures. How does that bias individuals when they are looking at applications? Clearly, if they're going to interview an applicant, they're going to see what the applicant looks like. But do they need it when they're reviewing the application? Or should it be shown during the rank list meeting? Exam scores, as I mentioned, if you've already used it as your criteria to narrow down the applicant pool, is it relevant anymore? Do you really want that to influence individuals' thoughts about other areas of the applicant you're trying to assess? And finally, the most important thing is actually to create a diverse committee to make these decisions, because we all have blind spots that are based on our own experiences. And so by having a diverse group of individuals involved in the decision-making process, and even coming up with a new process that you will use for selection, this helps prevent those implicit biases that we may not recognize. So I want to move on to interactions with applicants. Again, some of the issues here. So we know that our life experiences shape our beliefs and values. So what we watched on TV, what movies we saw, what we read in the news, where we were educated, who we see in the grocery store, on the streets, and even where we've traveled, who we've come into contact with, how familiar we are with other cultures. And all of those feed into our implicit biases. Now, I'm not going to spend time talking about implicit bias other than to say that these are things that we are not aware of, that we are biased against based on our experiences. And if you're interested in exploring this topic more, Dr. Quinn Capers had come and given a talk here about this topic that, again, is available on YouTube. But recognizing that we all have biases, even when we're well-meaning, is important in this process. But not all bias is bad. Actually, there are likeness biases that result in us having increased positive feelings towards applicants. So whenever we see somebody that maybe looks like us or has similar experiences to us, we usually have a more positive outlook on that applicant. And this can bias us positively towards individuals. So what can we do to combat some of these both negative and positive implicit biases to make things a little bit more fair and equal among individuals? Well, again, the most important thing is having a diverse group of individuals involved. So you should think about, what do I want my program, my faculty, the award recipients to look like? And you should make sure that your committee, the people making that selection or being involved in interviews, mirror what you want. Because again, this is more likely to have various implicit biases cancel out, but it will also bring forth different perspectives about why applicants may have had struggles in different ways. And then trying to standardize any process that you're using to select individuals. So for example, in the interview, we know that many interviews are unstructured because it's easier to get people to come and do unstructured interviews. But having a structured behavioral interview is more reliable and more valid in predicting things that we care about. And multiple mini interviews is something that has been used primarily in the UK, some in Canada too. But these are like little stations of interviews, or sometimes even skill practice that take about 5 to 8 minutes. And people rotate through maybe 7 to 12 stations. So if done well and developed well, this results in, again, more reliable and valid selection of applicants. But it has to be created and developed well and validated at the institution. Now, besides running the interview, you need to think about your rating form. So let's say that you have something that you want your interviewers to rate applicants on. Maybe it's their leadership skills. Well, maybe the interview is not the best time, but maybe you're having them look at their application. If you have a large scale, this is something that we often like because we're trying to discriminate between applicants. But the problem is that what I think is a 5 and what someone else thinks is a 5 is probably different. And so there can be issues with inter-rater reliability that can disadvantage some applicants. So having a more defined criteria that people are looking at by using some type of descriptive anchor can be more helpful. Next, we need to increase individuals' awareness of their implicit biases. So the implicit association test is one thing that has been widely promoted to be used, but we need to go beyond this by having workshops, case discussions, things like that, to again, make us all aware of our own implicit biases that we may not know about. And some things that I do to reflect on this is to think about who I select for opportunities. How diverse are my mentees? Who do I ask to co-author papers with me? Who do I sponsor for talks or recommend for awards? Does that group look diverse? And when I'm evaluating or grading people, does that differ systematically based on certain demographic characteristics? So looking at my clinical evaluations, what about my narrative comments? What about my interview ratings? And how do those ratings compare to other raters? So again, thinking about all of this can make us better able to rate people fairly. And then before making a decision, check your biases. So there are some evidence-based ways that have been shown to be helpful in combating implicit bias. Some of these are considering the opposite. So you have an initial impression of an applicant, re-review the data, look for evidence supporting the opposing impression. If you notice that you have a negative bias towards somebody, use a counter stereotypical exemplar or somebody in that same demographic group that you admire. Try to use likeness bias to your advantage by looking for ways to form common identity with applicants that you feel like you maybe don't have quite as much in common with. And finally, think about the applicant's experiences and what may have been like to walk in their shoes. So again, before making your decision, think about these things. And then after you make your rating of an individual, think about how that compares to your average rating. Is that fair? And if you're writing comments, have you used biased language? I think that gender bias is something that we see a lot. There's a lot of evidence showing that this happens. And there is this great gender bias calculator online that you can copy and paste narrative into and see if you're using more female or male associated words. Unfortunately, there's not the same thing currently that I'm aware of for other types of bias, but this worksheet from UCSF has a great faculty guide with examples of how bias or stereotype may show up in narrative evaluations. So that was a lot of information that is really meant to have us all reflect on our current processes. And it can seem like a lot. And I feel like for many of us, it's very demoralizing and we feel like, what can we actually do now? And so I want to give examples of ways that other places have actually changed things and resulted in increased diversity, despite all the obstacles and issues that I mentioned. So this is an example of AOA selection. This was a medical school who decided to change their process because they recognized that they did not have a high number of those individuals underrepresented in medicine within AOA. So what they did is they moved to a more holistic selection process. And what that looked like was diversifying their committee membership. So looking for more diverse educators to join and including some trainees in the process. They also changed their selection criteria in training. So before they used primarily academic criteria, but they added some additional professional criteria. And they actually created reviewer instruments and trained people on how to use those instruments. Before, they didn't use any of this to review applications. Then they increased the number of individuals eligible to actually be an AOA. So they made the academic criteria less stringent, but still required people who were excellent academically. And they made the review of applications blinded. So people didn't know the individual that they were reviewing the application of. And what they saw is that those underrepresented in medicine who were both eligible and selected increased by 3 times. Here's an example of a residency program and what they did. So they took a lot of the things that I mentioned about both individual interpersonal interactions and system changes, including mandatory training of bias, case discussions. They had small ranking teams. They standardized interview questions. They did not show photos during the ranking process. They also revised their rubric to make sure that they actually had metrics that they cared about and changed the weight of those different metrics. They made their scoring guidelines really explicit and tried to make sure that everybody had the same concept of those attributes they were trying to measure. They diversified their ranking committee and set some explicit goals for recruitment to ensure that they were recruiting a diverse applicant pool. What they saw was, again, an increase in their intern class and those underrepresented in medicine by 3 times over the course of 2 years. And finally, for faculty recruitment, this was a surgery program who was recruiting new faculty, and they were trying to diversify. They decided to advertise things in a more inclusive way. So typically for a lot of faculty positions, we know that advertisement may be limited. Sometimes it's word of mouth, sometimes there's nothing posted. So instead, they advertised all of their faculty positions broadly in many different venues, including organizations focused on individuals underrepresented in medicine. They had a requirement for a diverse applicant pool, and they created a new diverse division-wide committee. So in addition to department leaders, this included individuals who were diverse in rank, in gender, in race, and in specialty. And for the interview, instead of just the individual get to know you interviews, they also had a group interview with standardized behavior-based questions. And finally, the hiring decision was made with the input of this committee who made a recommendation to the department leaders. So they did not provide any data on their faculty previously, but I think we can probably agree that this is fairly diverse for 8 new applicants who were accepted by their program. 33% underrepresented in medicine and 50% women. So for all of us trying to ensure that we have diversity in programs we're looking at, it's important that we collect data and see how these changes that we make impact diversity. So we need to know how many apply, how many are offered interviews, how many accept, what about job offers, jobs that are accepted, to see where we are breaking down in the process so that we can think about why that may be happening and how we can fix it. So some take-home points. Diversity drives excellence. We often see this as more of a social justice issue. It is not only a social justice issue, it actually helps us have better outcomes. So we should not see it as a competing concept, and we should purposely try to increase diversity. We need to ensure that when we're using metrics, that they are not only valid at predicting what we care about, but that they're also equitable. And I've mentioned many of these for training programs and have data on the handout provided. We need to combine both individual bias training, which I feel like we have talked about a lot more, but really revamping the selection process, and those systemic changes are incredibly important. And finally, doing these changes with what we have now can actually increase diversity. So the bottom line is we cannot eliminate all bias in any process, but what we can do is mitigate systemic bias. So what I would like to ask is for everyone to think about one thing that you can propose for a change in a selection process that you're either involved in or that you see happening. I think that we all need to be responsible for this and think about it. And so I will let everybody reflect on that. And if you weren't able to get the handout in the chat, here is a QR code that should give you access. So thank you, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Jen. That was fantastic. So let me, please feel free to put questions in the chat or raise your hand, and I'll call on you to unmute. Let me pose the first question here that's in the chat to you. Great presentation. Made me think of how we can improve things in selection process. Should there be points for candidates with disadvantaged backgrounds?
Yes. So I would say yes. And this is something that I know many programs have done. And on the handout, I also provide lots of examples of publications out there that kind of show different processes places have done. But this is definitely one of the things that is mentioned and that has been shown to be successful in recruiting people, because we know that there are systems disadvantages for individuals. And so this is helpful to mitigate that.
Great. I think that Dr. Manning has a question and can unmute. Is that true?
Can you hear me?
I sure can.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Dr. Spicer, thank you so much for an outstanding talk. I'm curious, from your opinion, what would you say is the single most important change that we could make, given what you know about our interview process, to help us move further in creating something more equitable that does not anchor in our biases?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So what I think is the single most important change to make is to ensure that there is a diverse population of individuals who are involved not only in screening applications, but involved in interviewing and involved in the decision making. So in that ranking committee, when people are ranking, we need people from diverse backgrounds, because again, that is going to be the best thing to help mitigate all of the biases that may come into play and provide different perspectives. So that seems to be probably the easiest and most beneficial change that can happen.
So following up, there's another question in the chat. What are your thoughts on including, oh shoot, off my screen, program coordinators and or nursing staff on selection committees?
Yeah, so I think that's a great idea. I think at the very least, we should be involving them in collecting information about applicants, right? Because things we care about, like professionalism, interpersonal communication, that are sometimes hard to measure with what we have currently. It says a lot what program coordinators and nursing staff think of individuals, right? Because that is when people aren't being watched all the time. And that shows how they act in different circumstances. So I think that involving people besides just physicians in decision-making processes in some way is helpful. So however you want to involve them, I think is up to different programs, but I think that their input should be taken into account.
Dr. Johnson, please feel free to unmute.
Hey, Dr. Spicer, that was fabulous. I really appreciate it. We're going to be looking at these materials for several of our processes. I wanted to ask you about this question that often appears on some of our evaluation forms as to whether or not this candidate would be a fit for our organization. So fit seems to cut both ways. Fit could be like, oh, they're like me, and that type of bias, or they can be like, they share values of our organization and share values of what's important in the work that we do. So maybe you could just elaborate a little bit on this fit question and how that cuts. Thanks.
Thank you. That is a fabulous question and something that comes up a lot. So I do think that fit is a really sticky topic because of what you mentioned and the tendency for that to mean people who look like us and lead to kind of a lack of change. And so I think instead of thinking about it as fit for a program. I think what's more helpful is thinking, does our program have things that will help this person succeed and things that this individual wants in their career? So for example, thinking about something like fellowship, where research is, a part of a lot of fellowship training. If somebody has a very well-defined research interest, thinking, do we have resources here that fit with that individual's interests? So not thinking about like, are they a cultural fit, but more, does your organization have what is needed to support that individual? And if not, is that something that you should have? So not using that as an excuse to, not take certain applicants, but what could we do to grow their career? Putting that applicant at the center and thinking about their career development and trajectory first.
I think Dr. Law put a comment in the chat that also speaks to that a little bit, which is that an important first step in embracing individual diversity in candidates is programs embracing and defining their own diversity, meaning that we must first understand what's excellent about our programs before we can define and seek excellent diverse candidates. I think is pretty apropos. I'll save my question here. Dr. Fonke has a question for you. Says, I feel like one of the constraints in our selection processes is the way applicants have to present data, or even the data they're permitted to present. Standardized applications, CV templates, et cetera, emphasize attributes that may or may not be valid, as you point out. I know many yearn for spaces on different applications, and AMCAS is better than ERAS to be able to point out barriers and other challenges. So what are your thoughts on all this?
So again, something really important. And I think this is why we use the criteria we use, right? It's all that we have. And so I think that we need to, as a profession and as a specialty, think about what matters and how can we change these processes. So one thing that's come up in discussions that I've had at other institutions is, for example, AMCAS for medical school has a lot more rich information about people's backgrounds, especially socioeconomically, and potential disadvantage, their parental income, are they a first generation graduate, and things like that. We don't have that on residency or on fellowship applications, but that allows us to put into context some of the things that I mentioned, knowing about people's resources and opportunities. So I think that, again, this is where we are kind of tied right now with what we have available. And we need to think, when we have applicants come for the interview day, is there information that we want to try to gain from them that would help us in decision-making during the interview process or some other process? In the absence of that, we're kind of stuck with what we have, but we can advocate to our organizations.
Yeah, I know that you and I have had conversations about this, because I feel increasingly like I don't know what reliable pieces of data are available to me to help us, make some of these decisions, but I'm not at the point where I'm quite ready to throw it to a lottery.
Well, and I think, again, one of the main points here is that these are all very accomplished individuals to get to this point in medical training. And I think we need to remember that trying to kind of sort between all of these small differences between individuals probably doesn't matter. And there is some aspect of chance to it regardless, and kind of give ourselves and everyone grace about that. But it's uncomfortable for us to think about how much chance plays a role.
Yeah, that's entirely true. There's so many questions here. Quick question: are there funds allocated for assisting with diversification of our committees?
So I'm not aware of that. I'm not aware of any funds. I think, just as we always talk about, we need to put money into things, especially when people are spending time. I think that's an important thing to consider, but obviously there are constraints to funding too. But it's something that should be thought of and considered.
Dr. Dressler is interested and curious about the whole lottery proposal. and is wondering about your thoughts if this is something that could be implemented or completely impractical as a mechanism to achieve diversity and fairness.
So I have come around a lot more on this concept of a lottery. I think it makes all of us a little uncomfortable because I do think that there's some importance of, there are certain differences between programs, in patient populations and geography and other things, in fellowship research mentors that kind of change what organization will be better for different people to train within. So I think considering the concept of a lottery and how can we still take those things into account, but then create a process that is a little bit more fair and equitable and takes less time for both the applicants and the people doing the selection, I think would be a much better way to do it. And I think we may see some other countries go towards something like that.
All right, I think we have time for one more question, but I was just going to quickly say with respect to also trying to get at more information, this year for the first time, ARIS had a supplemental application that included opportunities for students to preference signal programs, but that it also had a specific section in it about challenges and barriers that got to different pathways or different roads that people may travel towards medical school, and to point out impactful experiences, I think, is a way to try and increase some of the richness of that piece. So I think Redantis is a great question. You pointed out some lessons and successes in achieving better diversity. I'm guessing we can also learn from recent efforts that failed to achieve diversity goals. Do people publish or share these failures, and what lessons can we learn from them?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think that typical as most literature, we don't often see negative studies or failed efforts published. But I think that's something that we can learn a lot from. I imagine that talking to individuals may get more at this, or even places that have published a successful experience. They probably had some issues when they first tried something and then revised it, right? So this is where collecting the data is really important to think about. And so I think that talking to individuals is unfortunately the best way, but I think this would be something great to see in the literature because we're all going to learn from mistakes, and we can't assume that just doing some of these things will automatically result in diversity. We need to measure it and make sure that it does.
I think we could ask you questions for a long time, but we're at after 1 o'clock. So thank you so much for this really, really interesting presentation and so thought-provoking, I think, for all of us. So I really appreciate your time.
Great. Thank you, everybody.